The screen door slammed behind Emma as she clutched the wadded bills against her chest, the sound echoing through the suffocating afternoon air like a gunshot. The money felt heavier than it should have. $200 in tens and twenties that old Pete had peeled from a roll thick enough to choke a horse. His yellowed teeth had gleamed when he'd seen the Harley, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she'd given away something worth far more than what burned in her small fists. The trailer park stretched before her like a graveyard of broken dreams. Mrs. Rodriguez hung laundry on a line strung between two dead palm trees, her movements slow and deliberate in the crushing heat. The Kowalski twins splashed in a kiddie pool filled with brown water, their laughter the only sound that didn't seem to wilt under the sun's relentless assault. Emma had played with them just last month, before her mother's belly had grown round and tight, before the sweating and shaking had started, before the word insulin had become as essential as breathing. Through the thin walls of Trailer 47, Sarah's labored breathing created a rhythm of desperation that had kept Emma awake for 3 nights straight. The sound pulled at something deep in her chest, the same place that had cracked when she'd watched Pete's rusty tow truck disappear around the bend with her father's motorcycle chained to its back. Emma pressed her face against the warm metal of their front door, listening. The breathing had stopped. Panic shot through her small frame like electricity. Had she been too late? Had the 20 minutes it took to walk to Pete's scrapyard and back been 20 minutes too many? "Mama?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper. A groan answered her, followed by the familiar sound of Sarah trying to shift her weight on the narrow couch that served as her bed during the day. Emma's shoulders sagged with relief so profound it nearly knocked her over. Inside, the trailer felt like the inside of an oven. The ancient air conditioning unit wheezed in the corner, producing more noise than cool air, while flies buzzed lazily around dirty dishes Emma hadn't had the strength to wash. Sarah lay curled on her side, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other dangling toward the floor where an empty water glass had fallen. "Emma? Baby, is that you?" Sarah's voice cracked like dried leather. "I got it, Mama. I got the money for your medicine." Emma held out the bills with both hands, as if offering a treasure to a queen. Sarah's eyes, once bright hazel, now dulled by pain and exhaustion, focused on the cash with an expression Emma couldn't quite read. Something flickered across her mother's face, a shadow of fear that made Emma's stomach clench. "Where did you—" Sarah's question was cut off by a contraction that made her gasp and curl tighter around her belly. "Oh God, the baby." Emma dropped to her knees beside the couch, the money scattered forgotten on the stained carpet. She'd seen this before, the way her mother's face went gray, the way her breathing turned shallow and fast. The diabetes was getting worse, and with it, the risk to both Sarah and the baby she carried. "I'll call Mrs. Chen to drive us to the clinic," Emma said, reaching for the cordless phone that never seemed to hold a charge for more than an hour. Sarah's hand shot out, gripping Emma's wrist with surprising strength. "Can't afford another emergency visit. The money, where did you get the money, Emma?" The truth sat in Emma's throat like a stone. She stared at her mother's face, noting the new lines around her eyes, the way her lips had gone pale. In the 6 months since Daddy's funeral, Sarah had aged years. The pregnancy was supposed to be a blessing, a new beginning, but instead it felt like watching someone drown in slow motion. "I sold something," Emma whispered. Sarah's grip tightened. "What something?" Before Emma could answer, a new sound penetrated the trailer's thin walls, a distant rumble, low and rhythmic, like thunder rolling across clear skies. But there were no clouds in the merciless blue overhead, and the sound was growing louder, more distinct. It wasn't thunder at all. It was engines, motorcycle engines, a lot of them. Sarah's eyes went wide with an emotion Emma had never seen before. Not fear exactly, but recognition mixed with something that looked almost like hope. The hand on Emma's wrist began to tremble. "Emma," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the approaching roar. "What exactly did you sell?" The rumble was getting closer now, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their trailer. Through the thin curtains, Emma caught glimpses of movement on the main road, dark shapes moving in formation, chrome glinting in the afternoon sun like scales on some massive serpent. Outside, the other residents of Dusty Creek had begun to emerge from their homes, drawn by the impossible sound of what seemed like an army approaching their forgotten corner of the world. Emma looked at her mother's terrified face and finally understood that some secrets were bigger than the people who kept them. The ordinary world. "Daddy's motorcycle," Emma whispered, the words falling from her lips like stones into still water. The color drained from Sarah's face so completely that for a moment she looked like one of the porcelain dolls in the thrift store window, beautiful and fragile and utterly lifeless. Her hand released Emma's wrist and moved instead to cover her mouth, as if she could somehow push the truth back into the world where it belonged. "Oh, Emma. Oh, baby, what have you done?" The rumble of engines grew closer, and now Emma could make out individual motorcycles within the approaching thunder. Dozens of them, maybe more, their deep-throated roars harmonizing into something that sounded less like transportation and more like war drums. Through the gap in their curtains, she watched her neighbors step out of their trailers with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright terror. Mrs. Rodriguez dropped her laundry basket, wet clothes spilling across the dusty ground. The Kowalski twins' mother rushed to gather them from their kiddie pool, water sloshing as she lifted both children at once. Emma had lived in Dusty Creek Trailer Park for all 7 years of her life, and she had never seen anything disturb their quiet, desperate routine. Their world consisted of early morning bus rides to Bakersfield Elementary, where she sat in the back row and tried not to let anyone see the holes in her shoes. Afternoons meant homework at the kitchen table, while her mother counted pills and rationed insulin, stretching each prescription as far as it would go. Evenings brought shared dinners of canned soup and crackers, followed by stories that Sarah told about Emma's father, carefully edited tales of a man who had loved motorcycles and freedom and his family in that order. But those stories had always felt sanitized, like photographs with the rough edges cropped away. Emma knew her father had died in an accident when she was 2, that he'd left behind the Harley and a small insurance policy that had long since been exhausted. She knew he'd been tall and dark-haired like her, that he'd called her little star and sang her to sleep with songs about the open road. What she didn't know, what Sarah had never explained, was why her mother's eyes always went distant when neighbors asked about him, or why they'd moved to this forgotten corner of California when Emma was 3, far from anyone who might have known him. Now, watching her mother's face crumble as the motorcycle engines grew closer, Emma began to understand that her ordinary world had been built on extraordinary lies. "Mama, why are you scared? It's just motorcycles." Sarah struggled to sit up, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward and painful. She reached for Emma's hands, holding them between her own trembling fingers. "Baby, your daddy wasn't just any motorcycle rider. He was part of something complicated. And if those engines belong to who I think they do..." A sharp knock on the trailer door cut off her words. Not the gentle rap of Mrs. Chen checking on them, or the hesitant tap of the Kowalski twins asking Emma to play. This was the kind of knock that expected an immediate answer. Emma moved toward the door, but Sarah's voice stopped her cold. Don't answer it." "But what if they know about Daddy's bike? What if they want it back?" The irony of the question hung in the air between them. Emma had sold the motorcycle to save her mother's life, to buy the insulin that would keep both Sarah and the baby alive until the next crisis. Now she faced the possibility that her sacrifice had brought something far worse to their door. Through the thin walls, Emma could hear voices, deep male voices discussing something in low tones. Boots scuffed against the wooden steps leading to their door. Someone was moving around the perimeter of their trailer, and Emma found herself wondering if this was what prey felt like when predators circled close. Sarah closed her eyes and seemed to be calculating something in her head, weighing options that Emma couldn't even imagine. When she opened them again, her expression had changed. The fear was still there, but underneath it lay a resolve that Emma recognized. The same determination that had gotten them through 18 months of widowhood, pregnancy complications, and grinding poverty. "Emma, listen to me very carefully. Whatever happens next, whatever these men say about your father, remember that he loved us. Everything he did, even the things that might sound terrible, he did to protect the people he cared about. Another knock, more insistent this time. Emma heard the sound of motorcycles idling just outside, a mechanical growling that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Her ordinary world of homework and canned soup and bedtime stories was dissolving around her, replaced by something vast and dangerous and utterly beyond her understanding. She looked at her mother, really looked at her, and saw not just the tired, sick woman she'd been caring for, but someone who had been keeping secrets that were finally demanding to be heard. The knocking came again, and this time a voice accompanied it. "Mrs. Chen, we'd like to talk to you about your husband, about Danny." Sarah's entire body went rigid at the sound of her husband's name. Emma watched her mother's face transform, fear giving way to something deeper and more complex, grief mixed with a recognition that seemed to span years of carefully buried memories. "Danny," Sarah whispered, and the name hung in the stifling air like an incantation. Emma had heard her father called many things in the stories her mother told. Daddy, Daniel, sometimes your father, when Sarah was particularly tired or sad. But never Danny. The name sounded different coming from the stranger's voice outside, weighted with familiarity and respect that spoke of shared history. The voice came again, patient but insistent. "Ma'am, we know you're in there. We just want to talk about the bike and about what it means to us." Through the thin curtains, Emma caught glimpses of leather and chrome, of men standing in formation like soldiers waiting for orders. The sound of idling engines created a constant rumble that seemed to shake the trailer's aluminum bones. She counted shadows, more than she could track, stretching down the main road of the trailer park like a dark river. Sarah struggled to her feet, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other gripping the arm of the couch for support. Her breathing had grown shallow again, but Emma could see this wasn't the diabetes. This was something else entirely, the weight of secrets finally demanding to be acknowledged. "Emma," Sarah said, her voice steadier than it had been all day. "I need you to go to your room, but Mama—" "Now, baby, please." Emma had learned to read the different tones in her mother's voice over the past 18 months. There was tired Sarah, who forgot to make dinner and fell asleep on the couch. There was sick Sarah, who needed medicine and quiet and gentle hands. But this was Command Sarah, the voice that had moved them across 3 states when Emma was too young to ask why, the voice that had enrolled Emma in school under a different last name than the one on her birth certificate. "I want to help," Emma said, standing her ground despite the authority in her mother's voice. "You already have. More than you know." Sarah moved toward the door with careful steps, her hand trailing along the wall for support. "You sold your father's bike to save our lives, but now we need to face what comes next." The knocking resumed, 3 measured raps followed by silence. Emma noticed how different it sounded from angry knocking or impatient knocking. This was the knock of people who had all the time in the world and weren't going anywhere. Sarah paused with her hand on the door handle. "When your daddy died, I thought his world died with him. I thought I could keep his 2 lives separate, the man who sang you lullabies and the man who rode with brothers who would die for each other. But that bike—" She closed her eyes. "That bike was never just a motorcycle, Emma. It was a symbol, a promise, and when you sold it to save my life, you did something that will change everything." Emma felt the last pieces of her ordinary world cracking apart around her. The homework she'd left on the kitchen table seemed to belong to another life entirely. The simple math problems she'd struggled with that morning. If a store sells apples for 50 cents each, how many can you buy with $5? Felt absurd compared to the equation she faced. Now, what do you do when saving your mother's life might have awakened something that was supposed to stay buried? "Mrs. Chen," the voice outside called again, "we're not here to hurt you or the little one. We heard what she did, selling Danny's bike for medicine. That's exactly something his daughter would do." The words hit Emma like a physical blow. His daughter. These strangers knew who she was, had somehow learned about her desperate trip to Pete's scrapyard, which meant they'd been watching, waiting, possibly for years. Sarah's hand trembled on the door handle. "They know about the money from Pete?" Emma nodded, her throat too tight for words. Then they know everything. Sarah straightened her shoulders, and Emma saw a ghost of the woman her mother must have been, before grief and poverty wore her down. Emma, what I'm about to tell these men, what you're about to learn about your father, it's going to sound impossible. But I need you to remember that love is complicated, and good people sometimes do terrible things for the right reasons. The trailer felt smaller than it ever had before, the walls pressing in, as Emma realized she stood at the edge of a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could run to her room, hide under her blankets, and pretend that her ordinary world of homework and canned soup could somehow survive what waited outside. Or she could stay and learn who her father really was, what the motorcycle had truly meant, and why 250 strangers had come to kneel at the feet of a 7-year-old girl who had sold everything to save her mother's life. Outside, the engines continued their patient rumble, and Emma made her choice. Emma's feet remained planted on the worn linoleum floor, but inside her chest, everything was running. Her heart hammered against her ribs like something caged and desperate, and her breath came in short, sharp bursts that made her dizzy. She watched her mother's hand hover over the door handle, trembling like a leaf in a storm, and suddenly the weight of what lay beyond that thin aluminum barrier crashed over her like a wave. His daughter. The words echoed in her mind, spoken with such certainty by a stranger who knew things about her that she didn't even know about herself. How long had these people been watching? Had they seen her walk to Pete's scrapyard with tears streaming down her face, the motorcycle keys cutting into her palm? Had they witnessed her standing in that dusty lot, listening to Pete's casual assessment of her father's pride and joy? 200, kid, and that's being generous for scrap metal, while her world fell apart around her? Mama, I don't understand any of this. Emma's voice came out smaller than she intended, the voice of a child who had been thrust into an adult world without warning or preparation. Why would strangers know about Daddy's bike? Why do they care what I did with it? Sarah turned from the door, and Emma saw something in her mother's eyes that made her stomach clench with a new kind of fear. It wasn't the fear of the strangers outside or even the fear of her diabetes complications. It was the fear of someone who was about to lose the last remnants of a carefully constructed lie. Because your father wasn't just Daniel Chen who worked at the auto shop and came home every night for dinner, Sarah whispered. He was Danny Ghost Chen, and these men, they were his family before we were. The revelation hit Emma like a physical blow. Before we were. The simple words rewrote every story she'd ever been told about her father. Every carefully edited memory her mother had shared. The bedtime tales of a man who loved motorcycles and freedom suddenly took on darker implications. What kind of family required nicknames? What kind of brotherhood came looking for you 5 years after you died? Through the thin walls, Emma could hear the strangers moving around their trailer, their boots heavy on the wooden steps and gravel pathways. She counted footsteps, too many to track, and realized that whatever her father had been part of, it was vast and organized and patient. They weren't going away. They weren't going to accept "we don't know anything" as an answer. What if they're angry about the bike? Emma asked, the question that had been gnawing at her since the first engine rumbled into their forgotten corner of the world. What if selling it was wrong somehow? Sarah sank back onto the couch, her hand pressed against her belly where the baby moved restlessly, as if sensing the tension in the cramped space. Oh, sweetheart, that's what terrifies me. In your father's world, motorcycles weren't just transportation, they were sacred. They carried history, brotherhood, respect. And his bike, she closed her eyes, his bike was special, even among special things. Emma felt the walls of the trailer pressing in around her, the stifling heat becoming unbearable as the implications of her desperate act crystallized. She had sold something sacred to save her mother's life, and now judgment had arrived in the form of leather-clad strangers who spoke her father's name like a prayer. The sound of more engines approaching drifted through the windows, not the organized rumble of the group already surrounding their home, but scattered arrivals, as if word was spreading through some vast network she couldn't comprehend. Emma moved to peek through the curtains and immediately wished she hadn't. The main road through Dusty Creek Trailer Park, usually empty except for the occasional pickup truck or mail van, now looked like a scene from a movie. Motorcycles lined both sides of the narrow asphalt, their chrome catching the afternoon sun like mirrors. Men in leather vests stood in small groups, talking in low voices while their eyes remained fixed on Trailer 47. "How many are there?" Emma whispered. Sarah didn't need to look to answer. "All of them. Everyone who rode with your father, everyone who owes him a debt, everyone who—" Her voice trailed off as another knock came at the door, gentler this time, but somehow more insistent. "Mrs. Chen, we know this is hard. But the little girl, Emma, she did something today that changes everything. We need to talk about what that means, for her and for you." Emma felt the last of her childhood slipping away like sand through her fingers. This morning, she had been a 7-year-old girl, worried about her mother's medicine and her unfinished homework. Now she stood at the center of something vast and dangerous and completely beyond her understanding. The simple act of selling a motorcycle to buy insulin had apparently awakened a sleeping world that her mother had spent 5 years trying to escape. She looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and saw not just her sick, pregnant mother, but a woman carrying secrets that had shaped every decision of their lives together. The engines outside continued their patient rumble, and Emma realized that running to her room wouldn't change anything. The door would still need to be answered. The truth would still demand to be heard. Emma took 3 steps toward her mother and placed her small hand over Sarah's on the door handle. The metal was warm from the afternoon heat, but her mother's fingers were ice cold despite the stifling temperature inside the trailer. "I'm not going to my room, Mama." Sarah's eyes widened. "Emma, you don't understand what you're—" "I understand that I sold Daddy's bike to save your life, and now people are here because of what I did." Emma's voice came out steadier than she felt, carrying an authority that surprised them both. "I understand that you've been keeping secrets about who Daddy really was, and that those secrets are about to come out whether I'm in my room or not." Through the thin door, she could hear leather creaking as the strangers shifted their weight, boots scuffing against wooden steps. They were waiting with the patience of people accustomed to getting what they came for. The sound of their presence, breathing, quiet conversation, the subtle movement of many bodies, created a pressure that seemed to compress the very air inside the trailer. "These are dangerous men, baby," Sarah whispered, but her grip on the door handle had loosened. "Then I need to be here when you face them." Emma moved closer, drawing strength from a source she didn't recognize, something that felt older than her 7 years, inherited rather than learned. "You said Daddy did terrible things for the right reasons." "Well, maybe selling his bike was a terrible thing too, but I did it for the right reason. And if that's what brought them here, then I should be the one to answer for it." Sarah stared at her daughter, and Emma saw the exact moment when her mother stopped seeing a child to be protected and started seeing someone who had already crossed a line there was no coming back from. The recognition was painful and proud in equal measure. "You sound just like him," Sarah said softly. Like Danny when he'd made up his mind about something dangerous. Another knock came, 3 measured raps that somehow conveyed respect and determination simultaneously. "Mrs. Chen, we've been riding for hours to get here. Some of the brothers came from as far as Nevada when word spread about what your little girl did. We're not leaving until we've said what needs to be said." Emma felt something shift inside her chest, a settling sensation like puzzle pieces clicking into place. These strangers had driven hundreds of miles because of her decision to sell the motorcycle. They'd dropped whatever they were doing, fired up their bikes, and converged on a forgotten trailer park in the middle of nowhere because a 7-year-old girl had chosen her mother's life over a piece of chrome and steel. That kind of response didn't come from anger. It came from something deeper. "Open it, Mama." Sarah's hand trembled on the handle. "Once I do this, everything changes. We can't go back to the way things were before." "The way things were before was you dying because we couldn't afford insulin," Emma said, her voice carrying a matter-of-factness that made Sarah flinch. "The way things were before was me watching you get sicker every day and not being able to do anything about it. If opening this door changes that, then maybe change isn't something to be afraid of." The engines outside continued their rumble, But Emma heard something else now. Voices carrying her name on the hot air. Not angry voices or threatening voices, but voices filled with something that sounded almost like reverence. She was no longer just the sick woman's daughter hiding in Trailer 47. She had become someone worth traveling hundreds of miles to meet. Sarah took a shaky breath and straightened her shoulders. Your father used to say that some moments choose you instead of the other way around. He said when those moments come, you can either step up to meet them or spend the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you'd been brave enough to try. Emma nodded, understanding flooding through her with startling clarity. This wasn't about the motorcycle anymore, or even about her father's mysterious past. This was about who she chose to be when faced with consequences that seemed too big for a 7-year-old to handle. She could hide behind her mother's skirts and let Sarah face whatever waited outside, or she could stand beside the woman she'd already saved once today and face it together. I'm ready, Emma said, and meant it. Sarah turned the handle, and the door swung open to reveal a sea of leather and chrome stretching beyond the boundaries of their small world. The man standing closest to the door was older than Emma had expected, his weathered face marked by decades of sun and wind. When his eyes met hers, she saw something that took her breath away. He was crying. "Hello, Emma," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We've been waiting a long time to meet Danny's little star." The older man wiped his eyes with the back of a hand, scarred by years of motorcycle maintenance and harder things. Behind him, Emma counted at least 20 more figures arranged in a loose semicircle around their trailer's small porch, all of them wearing the same expression of reverent disbelief. Their leather vests bore patches she didn't recognize, symbols and words that spoke of a brotherhood she was only beginning to understand. "I'm Razor," the man said, his voice gentler than his appearance suggested. "I was your daddy's road captain for 12 years. We rode together from San Diego to Seattle, through snowstorms and desert heat and things that would give normal people nightmares." He paused, studying Emma's face with the intensity of someone comparing her to a memory. "You got his eyes, little star, same color, same fire burning behind them." Emma felt Sarah tense beside her. But something inside Emma herself was awakening, a recognition that went deeper than conscious thought. The way this stranger said little star carried echoes of bedtime stories, of a voice singing her to sleep with words she'd thought were just her father's invention. "Daddy used to call me that," she whispered. "Course he did." A woman's voice came from the group, and Emma saw a figure step forward, tall and lean with graying hair braided down her back and arms covered in intricate tattoos. Danny talked about his little star every time he came back from family visits. Said you were the brightest thing in a world full of darkness. More of them began to speak, their voices overlapping in a chorus of memories that painted a picture Emma had never imagined. He carried your picture in his wallet, right next to his road name registration. Showed us videos of you taking your first steps on his phone. Said he was going to teach you to ride when you turned 16, but only if you promised never to join a club. Emma's legs felt weak. These weren't angry strangers come to punish her for selling sacred property. These were people who had known her before she knew herself, who had watched her grow up through her father's stories and photographs, who had mourned her loss when Danny died without ever getting to meet the child he'd spoken of with such obvious love. "But," Emma managed, her voice small in the face of such overwhelming information, "I did something wrong. I sold his bike. I didn't know it was important. I just needed—" "You needed to save your mama's life," Razor interrupted. And when he smiled, Emma saw gold teeth glinting in the afternoon sun. "Little star, that's not something to apologize for. That's something to be proud of." Sarah spoke for the first time since opening the door. "I don't understand. In your world, aren't motorcycles sacred? Aren't there rules about—" "There are rules," the woman with the braids said. "But there are higher rules too. And the highest rule of all is that you protect family, no matter what it costs." She looked directly at Emma. "What you did today, selling your daddy's bike to buy medicine for your mama, that's exactly what Danny would have done. That's exactly what he did do, more than once." Razor nodded. "Your daddy's bike wasn't just chrome and steel, Emma. It was a symbol of who he was, what he stood for. And you know what he stood for, more than anything else? Emma shook her head, overwhelmed by the revelation that her quiet, gentle father had lived an entire second life she'd never suspected. Family, Razor said simply, taking care of the people who couldn't take care of themselves. Your daddy died protecting kids who had nobody else to protect them. So when we heard that his daughter sold his most prized possession to save her mama's life, he gestured to the crowd of leather-clad figures surrounding their trailer. Well, that told us everything we needed to know about what kind of person Danny raised. Emma felt something fundamental shifting inside her understanding of the world. Her desperate act hadn't been a betrayal of her father's memory. It had been a fulfillment of it. The courage that had driven her to Pete's scrapyard, the determination to save her mother no matter the cost, those weren't things she'd found in herself despite her father's absence. They were things he'd left behind for her to discover. There's more you need to know, the braided woman said, her expression growing serious. About why Danny left the club, about what he was protecting you from, and about what his enemies might do now that they know he had a daughter. Emma felt the summer heat press against her skin like a warning, but inside her chest, something that had been sleeping for 7 years was finally waking up. The ordinary world of homework and canned soup was gone forever, replaced by something vast and dangerous and full of possibilities she couldn't yet imagine. I'm ready to learn, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The braided woman, who introduced herself as Valkyrie, stepped closer to the trailer's threshold, but stopped when Sarah instinctively moved to shield Emma. The gesture wasn't lost on any of the bikers, and Emma watched recognition pass between them like a silent conversation. We're not here to hurt anyone, Valkyrie said, raising her hands palm out. But what we need to discuss isn't trailer park conversation. Too many ears, too many eyes. And Danny's enemies. She glanced around the assembled crowd of onlookers from neighboring trailers who had emerged to gawk at the spectacle. They have ways of learning things they shouldn't know. Emma felt the weight of hidden gazes pressing against her skin. Mrs. Rodriguez from Trailer 52 stood in her doorway with a cell phone raised, obviously recording. The teenage boys who usually spent their afternoons skateboarding had gathered near the mailboxes, pretending to be casual while straining to overhear every word. Even old Mr. Kowalski had wheeled his oxygen tank onto his porch for a better view. Where? Sarah asked, her voice tight with the strain of holding together a life that was disintegrating by the minute. Razor gestured toward the main road, where Emma could see a convoy of pickup trucks and RVs that hadn't been there an hour ago. We've got a secure location about 20 miles out. Private land, no cell service, no curious neighbors. Place where Danny used to come when he needed to think through complicated problems. The mention of her father having a secret place, somewhere he went to wrestle with decisions Emma would never know about, hit her like a physical blow. How many parts of Daniel Chen had been hidden from his own daughter? How many midnight rides had taken him to this mysterious location where he'd apparently planned strategies and made choices that were now reaching forward through time to reshape her world? I can't travel that far, Sarah said, one hand pressed against her swollen belly. The baby, my blood sugar. We've got a medic, Valkyrie interrupted. Trauma-trained, knows how to handle pregnancy complications. Better equipped than anything you'll find in Bakersfield. She paused, reading the skepticism in Sarah's expression. Danny made sure we learned to take care of our own. That includes family. Emma studied the faces surrounding their trailer and realized that these weren't the stereotypical outlaw bikers from movies and television shows. Many were older, weathered by years but carrying themselves with the disciplined bearing of people accustomed to responsibility. She spotted gray hair, reading glasses, wedding rings. These were fathers and grandfathers, people who had built lives beyond whatever brotherhood had connected them to her father. But she also saw the harder edges, scars that spoke of violence, tattoos that marked territory and allegiance, eyes that held memories of things she couldn't imagine. Whatever her father had been part of existed in the space between ordinary life and something much more dangerous. What if we say no? Emma asked, the question emerging from a part of her mind that was rapidly learning to think several steps ahead. What if we just want to go back to the way things were? Razor and Valkyrie exchanged a look that made Emma's stomach clench with understanding. Going back wasn't an option anymore. The moment she'd walked into Pete's scrapyard with her father's keys, she'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped or reversed. "Little Star," Razor said gently, "the people your daddy died fighting, they never stopped looking for what he took from them. They never stopped believing he hid something valuable before he died. And now," he gestured toward the crowd of gawking neighbors, the cell phone cameras, the unmistakable spectacle of 250 motorcycle engines announcing to the world that Danny Chen's family was no longer hidden. "Now they know where to find us," Emma finished, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. Sarah sank against the doorframe, the color draining from her face as the full implications crashed over her. 5 years of carefully maintained anonymity, 5 years of being just another single mother struggling to make ends meet in a forgotten corner of California. All of it destroyed in a single morning by Emma's desperate act of love. "How long do we have?" Sarah whispered. Valkyrie's expression grew grimmer. "Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days. Depends on how fast word travels through the networks Danny used to run in." She looked directly at Emma. "Your daddy made some powerful enemies when he chose family over brotherhood. They've been patient, but patience has limits." Emma felt the weight of choice settling on her shoulders like a mantle she was too small to carry. Stay in the trailer park and wait for unknown enemies to arrive, or follow these leather-clad strangers into an uncertain future that might offer protection or might be just another kind of trap. But as she looked at her mother, sick, pregnant, and terrified, Emma realized the choice had already been made. The moment she'd decided to save Sarah's life, she'd accepted whatever consequences followed. "When do we leave?" Emma asked, her 7-year-old voice carrying the weight of decisions no child should have to make. Valkyrie's radio crackled to life before she could answer Emma's question. A male voice, distorted by static and road noise, cut through the desert heat. "Val, we've got movement on Highway 58. 3 black Escalades, tinted windows, heading toward Bakersfield fast. Could be nothing, could be everything." Emma felt the atmosphere around the trailer shift like air pressure before a storm. The bikers who had seemed relaxed moments before were suddenly alert, hands moving to positions she didn't want to think about. Razor pulled out a phone and began typing rapidly, his weathered fingers surprisingly nimble on the small screen. "That's our answer," Valkyrie said grimly. "We leave now." Sarah pushed herself away from the doorframe, maternal instinct overriding her physical weakness. "Emma, go pack whatever you can't live without. 1 bag, nothing more." But Emma found herself frozen, staring at the assembled faces that had transformed from gentle remembrance to something harder and more purposeful. The weight of realization crashed over her like cold water. These weren't just her father's old friends come to pay respects. They were soldiers preparing for war. "I don't understand," she whispered. "What did Daddy take? What do these people want?" Razor knelt down to her eye level, his scarred hands gentle on her shoulders. "Your daddy discovered something terrible, little star. People were hurting children, selling them like property. When he tried to stop it," the older man's voice caught. "He had to choose between his club and doing what was right. He chose right, but it cost him everything. Including his life," Valkyrie added quietly. "Danny gathered evidence, names, financial records, enough to destroy some very powerful, very dangerous people. When he died, that evidence disappeared with him." Emma felt pieces of her father's puzzle clicking together in ways that made her stomach hurt. The late-night phone calls he'd sometimes taken on the porch, the way he'd seemed sad even when he was smiling, the locked filing cabinet in his bedroom that Sarah had donated to Goodwill after his death without ever opening it. "You think I know where it is?" Emma said, the understanding hitting her like a physical blow. "That's why those people in the black cars are coming. They think Daddy told me something before he died." "Did he?" The question came from behind Razor, spoken by a younger biker with arms covered in military tattoos. His voice carried an urgency that made Emma's skin crawl. But Emma's mind was racing backward through memories she'd always treasured, now seeing them through a different lens. her father teaching her to memorize license plate numbers by turning it into a game. The way he'd made her repeat their address, phone number, and Sarah's full name until she knew them perfectly. The stories he'd told about brave princesses who had to guard magical treasures from evil knights. He taught me things, she said slowly, but I thought they were just games. Valkyrie's radio crackled again, escalades just past the truck stop. 20 minutes out, maybe less. The transformation that swept through the assembled bikers was immediate and terrifying. Emma watched grandfatherly figures become something predatory, watched casual conversation replace itself with hand signals and positioning that spoke of military training. This wasn't a motorcycle club gathering anymore. This was a tactical operation. "Sarah, get Emma to the blue RV," Razor commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Valkyrie, take point. I want scouts on every road leading out of here." He looked directly at Emma, and she saw something in his eyes that made her feel simultaneously protected and deeply afraid. "Little star, whatever your daddy taught you, whatever games you think you were playing, you're about to find out how real they were." Emma felt her childhood ending like a door slamming shut. The games weren't games. The stories weren't stories. Her father hadn't been teaching her to memorize random information. He'd been preparing her for exactly this moment when the enemies he'd died fighting would finally track down the family he'd died protecting. As Sarah grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the blue RV, Emma caught a glimpse of their trailer through the chaos of preparing motorcycles and shouted orders. It looked smaller than it had an hour ago, like a dollhouse from a life that belonged to someone else. The insulin she'd bought with her father's motorcycle sat on the kitchen counter, the medication that had started this entire cascade of revelation and danger. She'd wanted to save her mother's life. She'd never imagined that doing so would force her to discover that her own life had been built on secrets, that powerful people were willing to kill to protect. The sound of motorcycle engines roaring to life filled the air like thunder, and Emma realized with crystalline clarity that whatever happened next, the 7-year-old girl who had woken up in Trailer 47 that morning was never coming back. The blue RV's interior smelled like leather and motor oil, with fold-out beds that spoke of countless nights on dangerous roads. Emma pressed her face against the tinted window as they pulled away from the trailer park, watching the only home she'd ever known disappear behind a cloud of dust and motorcycle exhaust. Sarah sat across from her, one hand pressed against her belly, the other clutching the insulin Emma had bought with her father's bike, the medicine that had started this nightmare. "We should have grabbed more clothes," Sarah whispered, staring at the single plastic bag containing everything they'd managed to salvage from their old life. "Your school books, the photo albums." "Sarah." Valkyrie's voice carried a sharp edge of authority from the driver's seat. "We've got problems." Through the CB radio, voices crackled with increasing urgency. The black Escalades hadn't stopped at the trailer park. They'd continued past, taking secondary roads that suggested intimate knowledge of the area's layout. Emma felt ice forming in her stomach as she realized these weren't random enemies stumbling around blindly. They were professionals who had been planning this moment for years. "They're hurting us," Razor's voice cut through the static. 3 vehicles. Coordinated movement. They know where we're going." The RV lurched as Valkyrie took a hard right onto a dirt road Emma didn't recognize. Through the window, she watched the organized convoy of motorcycles scatter in different directions, following what looked like a predetermined plan. But instead of feeling safer, Emma found herself gripped by a horrible understanding. Her father's friends were outnumbered and outgunned by an enemy that had spent 5 years preparing for this day. "Mama," Emma said quietly, "what happens if they catch us?" Sarah reached across the narrow aisle and pulled Emma against her, but the embrace felt desperate rather than comforting. "They won't catch us, baby. These people knew your daddy. They'll protect us." But Emma could see the doubt in her mother's eyes, could hear the forced optimism that adults used when they were trying to convince themselves as much as the children they spoke to. Through the CB radio, she listened to the bikers' voices growing more tense as their escape routes disappeared one by one. Roads blocked at Miller Creek, came a report that made Valkyrie curse under her breath. "Highway 223 has state police cruisers," reported another voice. "They're not moving to intercept. just watching. Emma felt the pieces clicking together with sickening clarity. The enemies her father had died fighting weren't just criminals. They had resources, connections, official backing. The same system that should have protected children from trafficking was actively helping to hunt down the one man who had tried to expose it. The RV's engine coughed, then caught again. But the momentary hesitation sent panic shooting through Emma's chest. They were trapped in a vehicle that couldn't outrun cars, being pursued by people with government connections, carrying secrets that Emma couldn't remember, but that might be the only thing keeping her family alive. Valkyrie, Razor's voice came through the radio with terrible finality. We need to talk about the nuclear option. Emma saw Valkyrie's hands tighten on the steering wheel. Not with the family aboard. What's the nuclear option? Sarah demanded, but the silence that followed was answer enough. Emma pressed her face against the window again and saw something that made her blood freeze. In the distance, barely visible through the heat haze, 3 black vehicles were closing in from different directions with mechanical precision. They weren't chasing anymore, they were surrounding. Her father had died protecting children from these people. He'd gathered evidence that could destroy them, then hidden it somewhere they couldn't find. For 5 years they'd searched in vain, but now they had something better than evidence. They had his daughter, the little girl he'd taught secret games that might contain the keys to their destruction. I remember something, Emma whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Both Sarah and Valkyrie turned toward her, hope and terror warring in their expressions. Daddy taught me a poem, Emma continued, her voice growing smaller as the black vehicles grew larger. About a treasure hidden where the Ghost Rider sleeps. I thought it was just a bedtime story, but... The RV's engine coughed again, longer this time, and Valkyrie pumped the gas pedal with increasing desperation. Through the CB radio, Emma heard the sound of motorcycle engines growing more distant as her father's brotherhood was forced to abandon their rescue attempt. As the first black Escalade pulled alongside them, its tinted windows reflecting the desert sun like dead eyes, Emma realized with crystalline horror that all of her father's preparation, all of his friends' loyalty, all of her own desperate courage meant nothing against an enemy that had spent 5 years planning this exact moment. The little girl who had sold a motorcycle to save her mother was about to discover that some prices were too high for anyone to pay. The black Escalade's passenger window rolled down with mechanical precision, revealing a man in an expensive suit whose face belonged in corporate boardrooms, not desert highways. Emma stared at him through the RV's tinted glass, her 7-year-old mind struggling to reconcile this ordinary-looking person with the monster from her nightmares. He looked like the bank managers who had rejected Sarah's loan applications, like the insurance adjusters who had denied their claims, bureaucratic evil wrapped in respectability. The man raised a cell phone to his ear, never breaking eye contact with Emma, and she watched his lips move in conversation with someone she couldn't see. The casual nature of his communication sent ice through her veins. This wasn't desperation or rage, this was business. Where the Ghost Rider sleeps, Emma repeated, the poem fragments tumbling through her memory like puzzle pieces searching for their proper places. In the valley where steel horses rust, beneath the Guardian's eternal gaze. Emma? What are you talking about? Sarah's voice cracked with strain, but Valkyrie had gone completely silent, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. The words were coming back now, triggered by terror and the strange clarity that sometimes emerges in moments of absolute crisis. Emma's father had recited the poem during their last bedtime story together, 3 days before his fatal accident. She'd memorized it like all the other games he'd taught her, never understanding that Daniel Chen had been encoding his final message in the rhythm of children's verse. Where iron eagles watch over sleeping giants, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger as the memories solidified. The truth waits in the heart of the mountain, guarded by the spirits of the brave. The RV lurched suddenly as Valkyrie yanked the steering wheel hard left, sending them careening toward what looked like empty desert. But Emma could see it now, a barely visible dirt track that wound between Joshua trees toward distant hills. The Escalade followed without hesitation, confirming Emma's growing suspicion that their pursuers knew exactly where this road led. Jesus Christ, Valkyrie whispered, and Emma realized the biker woman had understood something that made her face go pale. He hid it at the cemetery. "What cemetery?" Sarah demanded. But Emma was already seeing the truth with perfect, horrible clarity. The poem wasn't just directions, it was a confession. Her father had hidden his evidence at the memorial where his fallen brothers rested, the sacred ground where no one would think to look because searching there would violate everything the brotherhood held dear. He'd turned his own grief into a shield, protecting his final gift to justice behind the graves of friends who had died in service to something larger than themselves. "The Fallen Angels Memorial," Emma said, the name emerging from memories she hadn't known she possessed. "Daddy took me there once, but I was little. I thought it was just a place with pretty statues." Through the CB radio, Razor's voice cut through static with desperate urgency. "Val, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, that ground is sacred. We can't—" "Danny already did," Valkyrie replied grimly. "Smart bastard knew we'd never desecrate our own memorial, so we'd never find what he left there." The RV crested a small rise, and Emma saw their destination spread below them like something from a fever dream. The Fallen Angels Memorial occupied a natural amphitheater carved into red rock, where weathered bronze sculptures of motorcycles and riders created silent testimony to brotherhood and sacrifice. But it wasn't the artistry that made Emma's breath catch. It was the realization that her father had chosen this place not just for its sanctity, but for its isolation. They were 30 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by desert that offered no escape routes, no witnesses, no help. The perfect place for conversations that powerful people preferred to keep private. The black Escalades had multiplied somehow, emerging from concealment with military precision. Emma counted 6 vehicles now, forming a loose perimeter around the memorial site. She watched men in dark suits climb out, their movements coordinated and professional. These weren't street thugs or angry criminals. They were government agents, corporate security, the kind of people who made problems disappear with paperwork and legal technicalities. "They've been waiting for us," Emma realized aloud. They knew where the poem would lead. Sarah pulled Emma closer, maternal instinct overriding her own terror. "How could they know? You just remembered it yourself." But Emma was understanding with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to children who are forced to grow up too quickly. The enemies hadn't needed to decode her father's poem. They'd simply needed to watch and wait, knowing that eventually someone would solve the puzzle for them. They'd used her as a bloodhound, following her desperate trail directly to the treasure they'd spent 5 years seeking. The RV shuddered to a stop beside a bronze sculpture of a rider whose face bore an unsettling resemblance to her father. Emma stared up at the weathered features and realized that Daniel Chen's story was carved in metal here, that his brothers had immortalized him, not knowing he'd already chosen to betray everything they'd built together. The little girl who had sold a motorcycle to buy medicine had just led her father's killers directly to the evidence that could destroy them, or her. The silence after the RV's engine died felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Emma stared at the bronze rider's face, seeing her father's features reflected in weathered metal, and felt something shift inside her chest, not the crushing despair she'd expected, but a strange burning clarity that tasted like steel and determination. "They used me," she whispered, watching the suited men arrange themselves with practiced efficiency around the memorial. "But they don't know what Daddy really taught me." Sarah's grip tightened on her shoulders. "Emma, what are you talking about?" The poem fragments were still tumbling through Emma's mind, but now she heard them differently, not as breadcrumbs leading to treasure, but as something far more complex. Her father had been a strategist, a man who'd survived years in a dangerous brotherhood by thinking 3 moves ahead. He wouldn't have left clues that led enemies to his evidence. He'd have left clues that led them into a trap. Through the RV's window, Emma watched Razor and his remaining bikers emerge from concealment behind the memorial's far edge. They'd been here all along, she realized, waiting in positions that suggested this convergence hadn't been accidental. The chase, the blocked roads, even their desperate flight, it had all been choreographed to bring everyone to this exact spot at this precise moment. "Val," Razor's voice crackled through the CB radio, "tell our little star it's time to finish what her daddy started." Valkyrie turned in the driver's seat, her scarred face transformed by something that looked like fierce pride. Emma, your father didn't just hide evidence here. He prepared a reckoning. Everything that's happened since you sold his bike, the bikers arriving, the chase bringing these bastards out into the open, Danny planned it all. Emma felt her understanding expand like ripples in still water. The pristine motorcycle hadn't been kept perfect as a memorial. It had been maintained as bait, waiting for the moment when desperation would force her to sell it and trigger a chain of events her father had orchestrated years ago. The Brotherhood's arrival hadn't been coincidence. The enemy's pursuit hadn't been improvised. Everything had been moving toward this moment since the day Daniel Chen had chosen to fight monsters instead of serving them. He knew they'd follow us here, Emma said, the truth crystallizing with perfect clarity. He knew I'd remember the poem when I was scared enough. He knew they'd use me to find what they were looking for. Smart girl, Valkyrie said softly. Your daddy always said you had his mind for strategy. Through the memorial grounds, Emma could see the suited men growing impatient, their professional composure beginning to crack as they realized the terrain offered fewer advantages than they'd anticipated. The bronze sculptures provided cover for defenders while leaving attackers exposed. The red rock amphitheater created natural choke points. Her father had chosen this battleground as carefully as he'd chosen everything else. But strategy alone wouldn't be enough. Emma watched more black vehicles arriving at the memorial's perimeter and understood that whatever plan her father had set in motion, it required something more than positioning and preparation. It required her to remember not just the poem, but the deeper lessons he'd hidden inside their bedtime games. The treasure isn't buried here, she said suddenly, the realization hitting her like cold water. It never was. The poem doesn't lead to evidence, it leads to witnesses. Sarah stared at her daughter with growing alarm. Witnesses, but Emma was already reaching for the CB radio, her small fingers surprisingly steady as she adjusted the frequency to match numbers her father had made her memorize as multiplication practice. The static cleared, replaced by the sound of vehicles approaching from multiple directions. Not more enemies, but the reinforcements Daniel Chen had arranged to arrive at precisely this moment. This is Ghost Rider's daughter. Emma spoke into the radio with a voice that carried more authority than any 7-year-old should possess. Code Phoenix is active. Repeat, Code Phoenix is active. The response came from a dozen different sources simultaneously. Federal agents who'd spent 5 years waiting for this signal, journalists who'd prepared stories they couldn't publish without proof, prosecutors who'd built cases they couldn't prosecute without witnesses. Her father hadn't hidden evidence at the memorial. He'd created an irresistible trap that would draw his enemies into the open, where the truth could finally find them. Through the memorial grounds, Emma watched the suited men's confident professionalism dissolve into panic as they realized they weren't pursuing prey anymore. They were surrounded by predators who'd been hunting them far longer than they'd been hunting her. The little girl who had sold a motorcycle to buy medicine felt power flowing through her veins like electricity. Her father's plan was perfect, unstoppable, and absolutely terrifying. Now she just had to survive it. Emma felt the weight of her father's legacy settling on her shoulders like a mantle too heavy for a 7-year-old to bear, but she couldn't turn back now. The CB radio crackled with confirmations as unmarked vans and civilian vehicles emerged from concealment points her father had established years ago. Through the RV's windshield, she watched the suited men's practiced coordination fracture into barely controlled chaos. "How many people knew?" Sarah whispered, her voice hollow with the realization that their entire desperate journey had been orchestrated by a dead man's foresight. "Everyone who mattered," Valkyrie replied, checking the pistol at her hip with grim satisfaction. Danny didn't just gather evidence against these bastards, he built a network of people waiting for the chance to use it. FBI agents whose cases got buried, prosecutors whose investigations were shut down, journalists whose stories were killed. They've all been watching, waiting for Code Phoenix. Emma pressed her face to the window and saw the memorial transforming into something that looked like a military operation. The bronze sculptures that had seemed peaceful moments ago now served as cover for federal agents taking strategic positions. the Red Rock Amphitheater, became a natural fortress, trapping the suited men in terrain they'd chosen but hadn't truly understood. The little girl who'd memorized her father's poems as bedtime stories now understood their true purpose. Daniel Chen hadn't just hidden evidence, he'd created a dead man's switch that would only activate when his daughter was in mortal danger, ensuring that his enemies would be drawn into the open at the exact moment when justice was ready to receive them. But understanding the plan and surviving its execution were different challenges entirely. The lead Escalade's door opened, and the corporate-looking man stepped out with his cell phone still pressed to his ear. Even from a distance, Emma could see his conversation growing more animated as he realized the scope of what was unfolding around him. These people had spent 5 years hunting Daniel Chen's secrets in shadows, using connections and corruption to stay ahead of consequences. Now they were exposed in daylight, surrounded by witnesses with badges and cameras. "They're going to run," Emma said, watching the suited figures near their vehicles beginning to shift nervously. "No." Razor's voice came through the radio with cold certainty. "They can't run. Danny made sure of that too. Look at the access roads." Emma shifted to see past the bronze sculptures and felt her breath catch. Every route that led away from the memorial was now blocked by official vehicles, FBI, DEA, state police, forming an impenetrable perimeter. The same isolation that had made this place perfect for secret conversations now made it perfect for arrests that couldn't be covered up or explained away. Her father's final trap was closing with mechanical precision, but Emma could feel the danger escalating rather than diminishing. Cornered predators were always most vicious in their final moments, and the people responsible for human trafficking networks didn't surrender quietly to federal agents. "Mama," Emma said quietly, "I need you to know something about Daddy, about what he really did." Sarah's arms tightened around her daughter. "Emma, whatever it is, we'll deal with it after—" "He saved children," Emma interrupted, her 7-year-old voice carrying weight that belonged to someone much older. "Bad people were selling kids, hurting them, and Daddy stopped it. That's why these men killed him. That's why they want to kill us." Through the RV's walls, Emma could hear shouting now, as federal agents began their approach. Bullhorns crackling with official demands for surrender, the sound of safeties being released and tactical gear being adjusted. The memorial that had been carved as a place of peace was about to become a battlefield, and Emma was trapped at its center. But she wasn't helpless anymore. The desperate little girl who'd sold her father's motorcycle had been transformed by understanding into something that made her enemies' hands shake when they looked at her. She carried Daniel Chen's strategic mind, his network of allies, and his absolute commitment to protecting children from predators who hid behind respectability. "This is Special Agent Martinez, FBI," a voice boomed across the memorial grounds. "You are surrounded and under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and violations of federal racketeering statutes. Drop your weapons and place your hands where we can see them." Emma watched the corporate man's face contort with rage and desperation. His cell phone conversation had ended, and she could see him making calculations, weighing options that all led to prison or death. These people had operated for years believing their connections made them untouchable. But Daniel Chen had spent his final months proving that no one was beyond the reach of justice when the trap was properly set. The final confrontation was beginning, and Emma Chen, daughter of the Ghost Rider, inheritor of his courage and his enemies, was ready to finish what her father had started, regardless of the cost. The corporate man's scream of rage cut across the memorial grounds like a blade, and Emma watched him pull a weapon from inside his jacket with movements that spoke of military training and absolute desperation. Around the amphitheater, his remaining associates were making the same calculation, that prison meant death anyway, so they might as well die fighting. "GET down!" Valkyrie roared, yanking Emma and Sarah to the RV's floor as the first gunshots cracked through the desert air. But Emma couldn't stay down. Everything her father had taught her through bedtime stories and memory games was crystallizing into understanding that felt like lightning in her veins. The bronze sculptures weren't just memorials, they were positioned to create crossfire zones. The red rock formations weren't just scenic, they amplified sound and provided natural barriers. Daniel Chen had spent his final months turning this sacred ground into the perfect trap, and now Emma held the key to spring it completely. She crawled toward the CB radio as bullets sparked off the RV's reinforced sides. Her small fingers found the frequency her father had disguised as her birthday, 728, and she keyed the microphone with hands that should have been shaking but felt steady as stone. "Ghost Phoenix to all units," she said, using the call sign that had lived in her memory as a pet name. "Pattern Delta is active. Repeat, Pattern Delta." The response was immediate and devastating. Hidden charges that her father had placed years ago detonated simultaneously around the memorial's perimeter, not to kill, but to eliminate escape routes with surgical precision. Rock slides blocked the access roads while leaving the federal agents' positions intact. The suited men found themselves trapped in an arena where every advantage belonged to the people who'd been hunting them. Through the chaos, Emma heard Razor's voice cutting through gunfire with deadly calm. "Danny, you magnificent bastard. Even dead, you're still 3 moves ahead." But her father's masterpiece was only beginning to unfold. Emma watched federal agents emerging from positions she hadn't even noticed, moving with coordination that spoke of months of planning and preparation. These weren't random law enforcement officers responding to a crisis. They were hand-picked personnel who'd spent years waiting for this moment, carrying evidence that corruption had kept buried. The corporate man was screaming into his phone again, demanding rescue that would never come. Emma could see the exact moment when he realized his political connections were useless against a dead man who'd spent 5 years building an unbreakable case. His face transformed from rage to terror as he understood that Daniel Chen had documented everything: names, dates, financial transfers, locations where children had been bought and sold like livestock. "Emma!" Sarah grabbed her daughter as a stray bullet shattered the RV's rear window. "We have to get out of here!" But Emma shook her head, feeling power flowing through her that didn't belong to a 7-year-old but came from her father's spirit and his absolute commitment to justice. "No, Mama. This is where it has to end." She keyed the radio again, her voice carrying across the memorial grounds with authority that made grown men pause in their desperate fighting. "My name is Emma Chen. My father was Daniel Chen, and he died protecting children from monsters who thought money could buy innocence. Today, his work is finished." The words triggered something that sent chills through every person present. From hidden speakers her father had installed throughout the memorial, his own voice began to play. Recordings made during his final weeks, documenting every detail of the trafficking network, naming every politician, judge, and businessman who'd enabled the horror. Emma watched the suited men's desperate resistance crumble as they realized Daniel Chen was testifying from beyond the grave, that their secrets were being broadcast to federal agents, journalists, and cameras that would carry the truth to audiences that could never be silenced or bought. The corporate man dropped his weapon and fell to his knees, not in surrender, but in the crushing recognition that he'd been outmaneuvered by a ghost. Around the amphitheater, his associates were laying down arms as federal agents closed in with handcuffs and evidence that would stand up in courts beyond the reach of corruption. But Emma felt no triumph, only the terrible weight of understanding what her father had sacrificed to build this moment. He'd died knowing she would have to live with the knowledge of what evil looked like, what monsters wore human faces, and what it cost to fight them. Through the settling dust and dissipating gunpowder, she heard her father's recorded voice speaking directly to her. "Emma, if you're hearing this, then you've learned what I couldn't bear to teach you while I lived. The world has darkness in it, but it also has people who choose to stand against that darkness, no matter the cost. You are my daughter, my greatest pride, and my hope that the next generation will do better than mine." Emma Chen, daughter of the Ghost Rider, inheritor of his courage and his terrible knowledge, stood in the center of her father's perfect trap and felt childhood dying inside her like a candle flame guttering out in the wind. The silence that followed her father's recorded words felt heavier than the gunfire had been. Emma stood in the center of the memorial amphitheater, surrounded by federal agents securing the scene, but she barely noticed them. The corporate man, the architect of so much suffering, knelt 20 feet away with his hands zip-tied behind his back, his expensive suit torn and dusty, his face a mask of defeat and disbelief. But Emma's attention was fixed on something else entirely. In the settling dust, she could see a figure that shouldn't have been there, translucent and shimmering like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. Her father stood beside the bronze memorial, wearing his Hell's Angels leather and the gentle smile she remembered from bedtime stories. "Daddy?" she whispered, taking a step forward. The corporate man's head snapped up at her voice, his eyes following her gaze to the empty space beside the memorial. "There's nothing there, you little freak. Your father is dead, and when I get out of this, you won't," Emma said quietly, not looking away from her father's spirit. "You'll never hurt anyone again." Daniel Chen's ghost nodded once, then gestured towards something Emma had missed in the chaos. Behind the memorial's base, a steel panel had slid open during the explosions, revealing a hidden compartment, not treasure or evidence but something far more valuable. Dozens of photographs of missing children, each one marked with locations and dates in her father's meticulous handwriting. The real treasure, Emma breathed, understanding flooding through her. Not money, not evidence, the children. She walked toward the hidden compartment on legs that felt disconnected from her body, aware that every adult present was watching her with expressions ranging from admiration to horror. The little girl who had sold a motorcycle for medicine was gone, replaced by someone who carried the weight of terrible knowledge and the power to use it. Inside the compartment, along with the photographs, was a single letter addressed to her in her father's handwriting. Emma picked it up with trembling fingers and read the words that would reshape everything she thought she knew about love and sacrifice. "Emma, by the time you read this, you'll understand why I had to leave you before you were ready. The children in these photographs are still out there, still waiting for someone to bring them home. I've given you the tools and the allies, but the choice is yours. You can walk away from this darkness and live a normal life, or you can pick up the torch I've passed to you. Either way, you are loved beyond measure." The corporate man was screaming now, demanding lawyers and making threats, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. Emma looked at the photographs of missing children, some younger than her, all of them trapped in nightmares that monsters like him had created for profit, and felt something crystallize inside her chest like steel. "Agent Martinez," she called to the FBI agent approaching with cautious respect. "Yes, Emma? These pictures show where they are. The children." She held up the photographs with hands that no longer shook. "My daddy found them, but he died before he could bring them home. Someone needs to finish what he started." Martinez knelt beside her, his professional composure cracking as he looked at the images. "Jesus Christ. These are from active cases going back 5 years. How did he—" "He never stopped looking," Emma said simply, "even when he knew it would cost him everything." Around the memorial, the cleanup was continuing. The suited figures were being loaded into federal vehicles, their network of corruption finally exposed to sunlight that would burn away their protective shadows. But Emma understood now that arrests were only the beginning. Her father's real legacy wasn't the trap he'd built or the evidence he'd gathered. It was the choice he was offering her. She looked again at the space where her father's spirit had been standing, but he was gone now, his work finally complete. In his place stood Razor, his scarred face wet with tears he wasn't ashamed to show. "Your daddy would be proud," the biker said quietly. "You finished what he started, little sister. The Ghost Rider can finally rest." But Emma shook her head, feeling power and purpose flowing through her veins like electricity. "No, he can't. Not while there are still children out there waiting to be saved." She turned to Agent Martinez, holding up the photographs with steady hands. "I want to help find them, all of them. My daddy taught me how to think like he did, how to see patterns and solve puzzles. I can help." Sarah appeared at her daughter's side, her face pale with understanding of what Emma was choosing. "Baby, you're 7 years old. This isn't your responsibility." "Yes, it is," Emma said with quiet certainty that silenced everyone present. "Daddy didn't just leave me evidence. He left me a mission." Emma Chen stood in the center of her father's perfectly executed trap and embraced the darkness he'd spent his life fighting, knowing that some torches could only be passed to those brave enough to carry them into the deepest shadows. The weight of her decision hung in the desert air like smoke from the gunfire. Emma felt the photographs of missing children burning in her hands, not with heat, but with the terrible responsibility they represented. Around her, federal agents continued securing the scene, but their voices seemed to fade into background noise as the true cost of victory became clear. "Emma," Agent Martinez said gently, crouching to meet her eyes, "what you're talking about, it's not just dangerous, it's a lifetime commitment. Once you step into this world, there's no stepping back out." She nodded, understanding flooding through her like cold water. Her father's letter had offered her a choice, but Emma was beginning to realize it wasn't really a choice at all. Not for someone who'd seen what she'd seen, who carried Daniel Chen's blood and his burden of knowledge. The photographs in her hands showed faces that would haunt her dreams whether she helped or not. At least this way, she could do something about the nightmares. "I know," she whispered, "but they're waiting for someone to find them." Sarah knelt beside her daughter, pregnancy making the movement awkward, her face etched with a mother's terror. "Baby, what you're asking for, it means giving up being a little girl. It means growing up with shadows and secrets and dangers that most people never have to face." Emma looked at her mother, really looked at her, and saw the same choice reflected in Sarah's eyes. Because helping Emma meant Sarah would lose something precious too, the illusion that her daughter could have a normal childhood, that they could walk away from this and pretend it had never happened. "I already know the shadows, Mama," Emma said softly. "Daddy made sure I'd be ready when I needed to be. The only question is whether I use what he taught me, or pretend I don't know what I know." Razor approached slowly, his massive frame moving with uncharacteristic gentleness. In his scarred hands, he carried something that made Emma's breath catch, her father's Hell's Angels patch, the one that had been cut from his jacket the night he died. "Your daddy earned this protecting kids like the ones in those pictures," the biker said quietly. "He knew what it would cost him, but he did it anyway. That's what real angels do. We protect the innocent, even when it destroys us." Emma reached for the patch, her small fingers tracing the worn leather and faded stitching. The moment she touched it, she felt something shift inside her chest, not magic but understanding. This wasn't just about her father's mission anymore. It was about who she was choosing to become. "If I do this," she said, looking between Martinez and Razor, "I can't be normal. I can't just go to school and play with dolls and pretend the world is safe." "No," Martinez admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "You can't. The knowledge you have, the instincts your father trained into you, they don't just disappear. You'll see patterns other people miss, notice dangers they ignore. It's a gift and a curse." Emma felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of grief for the childhood she was about to sacrifice willingly. 7 years old, and she was choosing to carry burdens that crushed grown men. But looking at those photographs, seeing faces younger than hers trapped in unimaginable horror, she knew there was really no choice at all. "What about me?" Sarah whispered, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. "What about the baby? How do I raise 2 children in this world you're describing?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Emma realized her decision didn't just cost her own innocence. It would reshape her entire family's future. Her unborn sibling would grow up knowing dangers that most children never imagined. Sarah would live with constant fear, watching both her children navigate threats that could destroy them. But then Emma remembered something her father had written in his letter, words that suddenly blazed with new meaning. "Either way, you are loved beyond measure." "We'll figure it out together," Emma said, her 7-year-old voice carrying certainty that belonged to someone much older. "Daddy left us protection. He left us allies. And he left us each other." She stood up, still clutching the photographs and her father's patch, and felt the last of her childhood fall away like shed skin. The little girl who had sold a motorcycle to save her mother was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. Someone who would spend her life hunting monsters that wore human faces. Agent Martinez watched her transformation with expressions of admiration and sorrow. "There's a facility in Virginia," he said quietly, "a place where children with unique circumstances, can learn skills they'll need while still getting an education. You wouldn't be alone. Emma Chen, daughter of the Ghost Rider, inheritor of his mission and his terrible knowledge, nodded once and stepped forward into a future that would demand everything she had to give. The victory was complete, but the price was a childhood sacrificed on the altar of justice. And Emma paid it willingly, knowing some battles could only be fought by those brave enough to become weapons against the dark. The memorial amphitheater fell into a strange, heavy quiet as the last of the zip-tied figures were loaded into federal vehicles. Emma watched the convoy disappear down the desert road, carrying with it the monsters who had haunted her father's final years. But instead of relief, she felt only the weight of what came next, the slow, grinding work of healing from wounds that went deeper than flesh. Sarah lowered herself carefully onto the memorial's stone steps, her pregnancy making every movement deliberate. The adrenaline that had carried them through the confrontation was fading now, leaving behind exhaustion that seemed to seep into their bones. "Is it really over?" she asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Emma sat beside her mother, still clutching the photographs of missing children and her father's patch. "The immediate danger is," she said with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to parse truth from wishful thinking. "But the work, that's just beginning." Agent Martinez approached with cautious steps, holding a satellite phone. "The first rescue teams are already moving on the locations from your father's intelligence. We've got children being pulled out of 3 facilities as we speak." His voice carried professional satisfaction, but his eyes remained troubled. "Emma, what you've done today, it's going to save dozens of lives. Maybe more." She nodded, feeling neither pride nor satisfaction. Only the terrible arithmetic of justice. Lives saved, but at costs that would echo through generations. Her own childhood was the smallest sacrifice among them, but it was the one she felt most keenly as it slipped away like water through cupped hands. Razor emerged from behind the memorial, where he'd been examining the hidden compartment. His massive frame moved with uncharacteristic gentleness as he approached, carrying something wrapped in worn leather. "Found this with the other documents," he said quietly, offering the bundle to Emma. Inside was a small journal bound in cracked leather, filled with her father's careful handwriting. Not operational notes or evidence, but something more precious. Letters written to her over the 5 years since his death, one for each birthday she'd celebrated without him. Emma opened to a random page and read words that made her chest tight. 7 years old today. I wonder if you still remember the ghost stories I used to tell you, or if Sarah's convinced you they were just fairy tales. I hope she has. I hope you get to be a little girl for as long as possible, even knowing I've prepared you for something harder. He never stopped being your father," Sarah said, softly, reading over Emma's shoulder. "Even when he had to become something else, you were always first in his heart." The truth of that statement was both comfort and burden. Emma could feel the weight of her father's love surrounding her, but she could also feel the expectations that came with it, not to be perfect, but to be brave enough to carry forward what he'd started. Agent Martinez cleared his throat gently. "The facility I mentioned, you don't have to decide today. Take time to process what's happened. Talk with your mother. Figure out what kind of life you want to build." But Emma was already shaking her head. The photographs in her lap showed children who didn't have time for her to process or delay. Some of them had been missing for years, growing up in darkness while she'd lived in the California sun. Every day she spent hesitating was another day they remained lost. "I'll need to finish school," she said practically, thinking through logistics with a mind trained by her father's puzzles. "And Mama will need help with the baby. But I can start learning what I need to know, reading files, understanding how these networks operate." Sarah's hand found her daughter's, fingers intertwining with desperate strength. "We'll do it together," she whispered. "I can't protect you from this world you're entering, but I won't let you face it alone." The setting sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, casting long shadows across the memorial grounds. Emma stood slowly, feeling the weight of her father's patch in one hand and the photographs in the other, symbols of inheritance and responsibility that would define everything that came next. Razor was organizing his brothers, preparing for the ride back to civilization. But he paused beside Emma, his scarred face gentler than she'd ever seen it. "Your daddy's watching," he said simply. "And he's proud." Emma looked toward the bronze memorial where she'd seen her father's spirit, knowing he was gone now but feeling his presence in the desert wind that carried promises and warnings in equal measure. She'd stepped across a threshold today, leaving childhood behind for something darker and more necessary. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, learning to live with secrets, training for battles she couldn't yet imagine, growing up in the spaces between justice and vengeance. But tonight, surrounded by her father's chosen family and carrying his mission forward, Emma Chen felt ready to become whoever she needed to be. The immediate war was won, but the real work was just beginning. The return. 3 months later, Emma Chen stood in the doorway of their new apartment in Bakersfield, watching her mother arrange baby clothes in tiny piles on the kitchen table. The cramped trailer was a memory now, replaced by clean walls and windows that actually opened, paid for with rewards from the federal cases her father's intelligence had cracked open. But comfort felt strange on skin that had grown accustomed to sharp edges. "The social worker called," Sarah said, without looking up from the soft cotton onesies. "She wants to schedule another check-in about your adjustment." Emma almost smiled. If only Mrs. Rodriguez knew what adjustment really looked like. Learning to sleep without checking the locks 3 times. Training herself not to analyze every stranger's body language for threat patterns. Remembering that most 7-year-olds didn't carry FBI contact cards in their backpacks, alongside juice boxes and crayons. "I'll tell her I'm fine," Emma said, settling into the chair across from her mother. The words weren't entirely false. She was functional, focused, no longer the terrified child who'd sold her father's motorcycle in desperation. But fine felt like a costume that didn't quite fit anymore. Sarah finally looked up, her pregnancy now visible in the gentle curve of her belly, and the way she moved with careful protection for the life growing inside her. "Agent Martinez called too. They recovered 6 more children using your father's intelligence. The youngest was 4 years old." Emma felt the familiar tightness in her chest. Not pain exactly, but the weight of mathematics. 6 children home with their families. 6 futures salvaged from darkness. The numbers mattered more than her own comfort, more than the childhood she'd traded away to make them possible. "That's good," she said quietly, meaning it completely. The apartment door opened, with a familiar rumble of motorcycle boots on hardwood. Razor appeared in the doorway, his massive frame seeming oddly diminished in the domestic space. He visited every week now, officially to check on their security, but really to maintain the connection that bound them to her father's memory. "How's my favorite little sister?" he asked, his scarred face creasing into something that almost resembled a smile. "Learning," Emma replied, which had become her standard answer to that question. It was accurate. She spent her afternoons after school poring over the educational materials Agent Martinez provided, studying criminal psychology and trafficking patterns with the same dedication other children brought to multiplication tables. Razor settled his bulk carefully onto their new couch, looking around the apartment with approval. "Your daddy would have liked this place. Clean, safe, good sight lines from the windows." Emma nodded, though she knew her father would have mixed feelings about their new life. The safety came with a price. Constant federal monitoring, regular check-ins with agents who treated her like a valuable asset, the knowledge that her choices had rippled outward to reshape everything she touched. "There's something else," Razor continued, his tone shifting to careful seriousness. "The club's been talking about your daddy's patch." Sarah's hands stilled on the baby clothes. They all knew this conversation was coming. The question of inheritance that went beyond money or property to something deeper and more complicated. "He earned it," Emma said simply. "I haven't." "No," Razor agreed. "But you've earned something else, something new." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small patch, different from her father's but clearly crafted with the same careful attention. Instead of the traditional Hell's Angels insignia, this one showed a motorcycle silhouette surrounded by stars, with small text that read, Guardian Angel. "The Brotherhood voted," Razor explained. "You're not one of us. You're 7 years old, for Christ's sake, but you're not nothing either. You're something new. Something your daddy helped create but never got to see finished." Emma stared at the patch, understanding its significance. Not membership in her father's world, but acknowledgement of the space she'd carved out between that world and the one most people inhabited. A recognition that some bridges couldn't be uncrossed, some knowledge couldn't be forgotten. "The children from the rescue operations," she said carefully. "Some of them will need help adjusting. Help from someone who understands what it feels like to grow up too fast." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, not sadness but recognition. Her daughter was finding her own way to carry her father's mission forward, threading the needle between justice and healing that had eluded Daniel Chen in his final years. "Agent Martinez mentioned a program," Sarah said softly. "Peer counseling for rescued children. They need someone who can relate to trauma without being consumed by it." Emma picked up the Guardian Angel patch, feeling its weight settle into her palm like destiny accepting gravity. Outside their window, the California sun was setting over a city that seemed safer now, populated by families who would never know how close they'd come to losing everything. She was no longer the desperate child who'd sold a motorcycle for medicine, but she wasn't the hardened weapon her father's path might have created either. She was something entirely new, a bridge between innocence and experience, carrying light into dark places without being extinguished by them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new children who needed guidance from someone who understood their particular kind of brokenness. But tonight, surrounded by love that had survived every test, Emma Chen felt ready to become exactly who she was meant to be, the new beginning. 1 year later, Emma Chen sat in a circle of small chairs in the children's wing of the Bakersfield Community Center, watching 8-year-old Marcus draw angry black scribbles across his paper. His file said he'd been found chained in a basement 3 states away, rescued in one of the raids her father's intelligence had made possible. His eyes held the same hollow wariness Emma recognized from her own mirror in those first weeks after everything changed. "I don't want to draw stupid flowers," Marcus muttered, his crayon grinding against the paper with enough force to tear it. "Flowers are for babies." Emma nodded seriously, understanding the rage behind his words. Flowers were for children who still believed in beauty without shadows, who hadn't learned that pretty things could hide monsters underneath. "What do you want to draw instead?" "Motorcycles," he said immediately, then glanced around the circle at the other children, a mix of rescued victims and local kids dealing with various traumas. Big loud ones that can run over bad guys. From her seat near the window, Emma's mother looked up from baby Daniel, now 6 months old and babbling contentedly in his carrier. Sarah had become the program's unofficial coordinator, managing schedules and logistics while Emma worked directly with the children. They'd learned to function as a team, trading responsibilities fluidly as circumstances demanded. "Motorcycles it is," Emma agreed, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. "But maybe we could make them special motorcycles, the kind that protect people instead of just running them over." Marcus considered this, his grip on the crayon loosening slightly. Around the circle, other children began abandoning their assigned art projects to lean in, curious about this alternative that promised power instead of just pretty pictures. Emma began sketching simple motorcycle shapes, adding details as inspiration struck. Flames that looked protective rather than destructive, wings that suggested flight toward safety rather than escape from consequences. The Guardian Angel patch was tucked safely in her backpack, but its symbolism guided her hands as she drew. "My dad used to ride," whispered Sophia, a 9-year-old who'd been trafficking through truck stops before her rescue, before the bad man took me. "Dad said motorcycles were freedom machines." "They can be," Emma agreed, adding another bike to her drawing. "When good people ride them." She thought of Razor and his brothers, who still visited regularly but had evolved from her father's war party into something more complex. Surrogate uncles who taught her practical skills while carefully respecting the boundaries Sarah had established. They'd helped her understand that strength came in many forms, that protecting others didn't always require becoming a weapon yourself. Agent Martinez appeared in the doorway, his presence no longer triggering the hypervigilance that had defined Emma's early months. He'd become a fixture in their lives, checking in on the children from various rescue operations while coordinating with Emma's unique insights. 5 more recovered this week, he reported quietly to Sarah, his voice carrying satisfaction tempered by exhaustion. The network your husband exposed just keeps yielding intelligence. Emma's pattern recognition has been instrumental in connecting dots we would have missed. Emma half listened to the familiar conversation while helping Marcus add details to his motorcycle drawing. The numbers mattered. Each child recovered represented a family reunited, a future salvaged, but they no longer consumed her thoughts the way they once had. She'd learned to care deeply without drowning in the weight of caring. "Miss Emma," called out Lily, the youngest member of their group at just 5 years old. "Can you draw one for my sister? She's still missing." The request hit Emma like a physical blow, reminding her that for every success story in their circle, countless others remained trapped in darkness. But instead of the crushing despair that such knowledge once brought, she felt something steadier now, determination mixed with hope. "Of course," Emma said, starting a new drawing. "What color should it be?" "Purple," Lily decided, "with stars, so she can find her way home." As Emma sketched the requested motorcycle, she felt the familiar presence that had become her constant companion, not her father's ghost which had found peace after the memorial confrontation, but his legacy living through her choices. Every child she helped, every connection she made between past trauma and future healing, added another thread to the network of protection he'd died creating. Baby Daniel gurgled from his carrier, reaching tiny fists toward the afternoon sunlight streaming through the community center windows. He would grow up knowing dangers that most children never imagined, but he would also grow up surrounded by people committed to standing against those dangers. Emma had learned that inherited trauma and inherited protection could coexist, that knowledge of darkness made light more precious rather than less. Outside, the sound of motorcycles rumbled past, Razor's brotherhood heading home from their weekly visit. The children barely glanced up anymore, accustomed to the protective presence that had once seemed so threatening. Normalcy, Emma had discovered, could be rebuilt around even the most unusual circumstances. "Time to clean up," Sarah announced gently, signaling the end of another session. As the children gathered their artwork and prepared to leave, Marcus paused beside Emma's chair. "Same time next week?" he asked, his voice still careful but no longer quite so hollow. "Same time," Emma confirmed, watching him walk toward his foster mother with steps that seemed slightly less burdened. Emma Chen packed up her art supplies and lifted her baby brother, feeling the solid weight of a future she was actively helping to build. She was 8 years old now, no longer the desperate child who'd sold her father's motorcycle, but not yet the woman she would become. In the space between, she'd found her purpose, using inherited strength to help others find their own. Tomorrow would bring new children, new challenges, new opportunities to transform pain into protection. But tonight, surrounded by family both chosen and born, Emma felt the deep satisfaction of work that mattered. The Ghost Rider's daughter had found her own road, and it led toward light,